then goes on to evaluate his education. This is the last 2/3 of part 1. And we can deal with this fairly quickly, I think. I covered it in one of the videos, if you recall. He goes through all the different subjects quickly and then more slowly, talking about the value of each discipline, of each subject. Let's take a look at page 3. I've been nourished on letters since my childhood because I was convinced that by means of them one could acquire clear and assured knowledge of everything useful in life. But as soon as I completed this entire course of study, I completely changed my mind. Why is this? What caused him to change his mind?
Like doubts and errors.
Yeah, doubts and errors, continue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, it says, more and more I discovered my ignorance. Okay, he's striking another Socratic note. Okay, my education only convinced me still further of how ignorant I was. And then he concludes at the end of this paragraph, right, thinks, well, I have at least an ordinary average mind. And I was quite wealthy and was able to attend the best schools in Europe. And our age, our time and place, this is Paris in the early 1600s, seems just as flourishing and fertile in good minds as preceding ones. This made me feel free to judge all others by myself and to think that there was no doctrine in the world that was of the sort that I had previously been led to hope for. And here's an interesting thing. So we've got finished just now with these professions of ignorance and expectations of modesty. And now we have a fairly bold claim at the end of this paragraph that because of these reasons given here above, I figure that my situation is the same as everyone else's. That since I couldn't find some kind of true doctrine in my education, some kind of certainty, that it's really not there to be found. Nobody can find it. I've suggested right here that there's a contradiction. Is there a contradiction, or is this compatible with what he said before? How so? And where's the contradiction that emerged?
He said that he doesn't know more than anybody else. People who feel like they know more judged. But then he said the safety net is saying, but you can decide on your own if it needed.
Right. I suppose he's saying, I guess you, the reader, can decide whether he's justified, what we're doing right now, whether he's justified in saying, I'm going to judge all others by myself. There could be a sense in which what he means here is that we're all equal in this. Not that I, Descartes, since I, Descartes, have not been able to figure this out, nobody can, but if an ordinary man like me can't figure this out using the best resources available, it can't be figured out. Other thoughts on this? Contradiction or not? Is he going back on his promise not to teach us anything, or is this the beginning of a kind of ironic Socratic course of instruction? He goes on to evaluate his education. He does say at the top of page 4 that philosophy provides a means of speaking plausibly about all things and of making oneself admired by the less learned. Okay? Not speaking highly of philosophy in that case. Philosophy seems to be a kind of vanity. He says, finally, I decided it is good to have examined all these disciplines, even the most superstition-ridden and the most false of them, in order to know their true worth and to guard against being deceived by them. So what's his take on his education? There's a bit of vanity involved in it. It's mostly useless, he seems to say. He goes through different subjects. We should guard against being deceived by them. What does he say particularly about mathematics? He does like it. What for?
Like solid.
Right. We get solid answers and proofs, not opinions. Because it has rock solid foundations, and because its methods are very clear and easy to understand, we can build up with them stepwise to advance knowledge, we can make progress in mathematics. So Descartes can, in 1637, look at mathematics even in his own day. He says, we certainly can say that we know more in mathematics than the ancient Greeks did, without question, even then. Today we can say that by many orders of magnitude. Do we know more in philosophy than the ancients? We're going to see later on in the Meditations a proposal for reforming philosophy along the lines of mathematics, but the most important thing to pay attention to, the foundations of mathematics, the methods of mathematics. He says at the bottom of page 4, I delighted most of all in mathematics because of the certainty and evidence of its reasonings, but I did not yet notice its true use. I was astonished that no one had built anything more noble upon its foundations, given that they were so solid and firm. That's going to be his opening, his project, to build something new in philosophy on the foundations of mathematics. So he finishes the review of his education at the bottom of page 5, and then he says, that is why, as soon as age permitted me to emerge from the supervision of my teachers, I completely abandoned the study of letters, just left the university. Where does he go instead? He travels. Okay, there's a great deal of talk here. He borrows a lot of this praise of travel from Montaigne, previous essayist. Resolving to search for no knowledge other than what can be found within myself or else in the great book of the world. I spent the rest of my youth traveling, seeing courts and armies, mingling with people of diverse temperaments and circumstances, gathering various experiences and testing myself in the encounters fortune offered me. For it seemed to me that I could find much more truth in the reasonings that each person makes concerning matters that are important to him than in the reasonings engaged in by a man of letters in his study. So I'm not going to look to the university or the established intellectual authorities for any kind of true wisdom. Look at the world among the common people. Common experience, we also should say here, something we saw emphasized also by Galileo and Bacon, observation. Observation of the world. And in myself, how does one seek knowledge inside oneself? I don't just close my eyes and make it up. How do I come to actual knowledge that way? Experiences, so I learn things, I observe things, I reflect upon them, I sift out which ones are valuable, which ones are not. The word I'm going to use here instead of contemplation is reflection. So I'm going to reflect my mind, my thoughts, back upon the workings of my own mind. We'll see Descartes doing this in part 2 of the Discourse, where he comes up with his method, and then also in the Meditations, where he begins, really does most of his work, by not just evaluating the contents of his thoughts, but also by reflecting upon what it means to have thoughts in the first place. Turning the camera, reflecting the camera eye, so to speak, back towards itself, and looking at the workings of his own mind. I'm going to think about how my mind works, and that's in part of that, that's the discovery of this method. So he concludes part 1. The final paragraph talks about the customs of people. I learned, he says, not to believe anything too firmly, of which I had been persuaded only by example and custom. And thus I little by little freed myself from many errors that can darken our natural light and render us less able to listen to reason. What's he thinking of here? What's he purging out of himself when he's discovering to set aside things that he learned only by custom? He's going through this kind of cleansing intellectually by traveling through the world. He's coming out from under the influence of the professors. Saying, I learned to disregard the parts of my education, especially things, the sort of dogmatic, philosophical parts of my education that I was persuaded of only by example and custom, and not by the natural light of my own mind. In other words, he's sort of taking full possession of his intellectual autonomy. Intellectual autonomy means using your own standards to judge for yourself on these intellectual questions. He thinks he's distinguishing this from dogmatic approaches that he was taught prior to this.
You said he was traveling.
Traveling all over France, Germany,
That's another way.
Central Europe.
Another way to find yourself. You get to reflect like you said, and learn new ways or customs.
Right. Right. This is a common theme in French writing at this time, is that people who never travel suffer, people who travel too much will suffer, but the right amount of travel will broaden the mind and give you a new insight upon things that were initially only customary. So the suggestion here is that a good bit of the philosophical world picture that he's critiquing seems to rest solely on custom. So something to keep in mind as we look at the four parts of it, at the four parts of his method next time. The emphasis on intellectual autonomy and what he thinks that, what's he contrasting that with? He doesn't use that term, but I'll use that term. He's talking here about people deciding for themselves. He's giving us a portrait of that himself as he sort of comes out from under and purifies his own education in his own mind. To contrast to intellectual autonomy, intellectual freedom or self-control is being under the influence of someone else, like dogmatism. So without coming out and saying it quite that boldly, he seems to be suggesting that a good bit of the philosophy prior to him is held dogmatically and not upon sufficiently critical grounds.